You're listening to the Virtue Podcast, brought to you by the Great Hearts Institute. Good conversations around the great conversation. Welcome back to the Virtue Podcast. I am Robert Jackson of the Great Hearts Institute, and I am so happy to be hosting two master teachers today. One has been training teachers for 3 decades in the art of composition, and another who currently leads a classical charter school in Glendale, Arizona. The first, Andrew Pudewa, is the founder and director of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, one of the most successful teacher and parent training programs in the country, and even beyond the 50 states. Thousands of homeschooling parents and school teachers have come to discover the powerful, enjoyable methods of the Institute for Excellence in Writing. And Mrs. Suzanne DeStefano has 2 decades of experience as a teacher, reading specialist, and administrator, and is now leading Great Hearts Archway at Glendale, a K-5 classical charter school serving 550 students. Welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, I'm fascinated because we got to meet both of you at our most recent symposium earlier this spring. And you packed the house, you packed the room anyhow, as you talked about copy work and how it affects composition. So I thought it'd be great to have both of you back. Andrew, you presented, and Suzanne, you were there interacting as sort of the MC, as it were, for that particular session. We want to talk a lot today, if we can, about the nature of writing and how we teach writing. So maybe we should begin with some of the most common ways that writing is taught across elementary and secondary grades so that we can just get a sense of the lay of the land. If I can start there, would you, Suzanne, tell us a little bit about what you've seen over 20 years?
Sure. My education actually began not in the classical world. I was at a typical district public school, and the writing curriculum consisted a lot of journal writing. Giving a child a piece of paper and an interesting high interest topic and asking them to write on it, an emphasis on using the hamburger analogy of the beginning, the ending, and some meat in the middle, some lists of words to use or not use. And it was an utter fail. Got my master's in education, took lots of classes on writing, and really there was not a lot of practical information in those classes in the teacher preparatory programs either. That was my experience before classical education.
Yeah. But it sounds as though you are already detecting, I detect some frustration. What was the difficulty involved in this training, such as it was?
Teaching writing is extremely complex. To have that neurological process to get the thoughts from the mind out onto the paper, where spelling, grammar, handwriting are so fluent that self-dictation process can happen, is a very complex one. And I found that students were having trouble even thinking in a complete sentence, starting there, let alone being able to get it out. And the emphasis on journal writing was really ineffective, that they would produce pages of things, but it was like a stream of consciousness with really poor grammar, lack of spacing, really handwriting that was difficult to read. So there was volume. They were building stamina and stronger finger strength, I suppose, but not quality work or really skills that were leading them to become better writers. And so they were frustrated. And as their teacher, I was frustrated too, because I wanted tools to help my students and I didn't know how to do it.
Well, Andrew Pudewa, you have some tools for us. And as I said, the session that you offered at Symposium was literally focused on copy work. So maybe you can help us. Let's talk about the nature. What is copy work? What is copy work?
Well, just to be totally clear, it started with copy work, and the title was From Copy Work to Composition, Teaching Writing Through Imitation. So the theme of the session was really on imitation. And if I could, I'd like to make an analogy to what Suzanne just mentioned. If we had taught music in this country the way we've taught writing for the last 4 decades or so, it would go a little bit like this. Yeah, come on over to my place. I'll teach you the names of the notes on the piano and how to sit and push the keys and how to put your feet on the pedals and all that. But there is one little rule here. you can't play anything that anyone else ever played. You have to kind of just make it all up on your own. So go home and fool around for 20, 30 minutes a day, and that's how you learn to play the piano. Well, anybody with any experience in that area would acknowledge the fact that that would be a very ineffective way of developing skilled pianists. What do? In music, which is my background, I was a full-time violin teacher for the first 15 years of my adult life. We do the opposite. We say, play this piece, play it exactly this way, imitate me precisely, and do this for quite a while. And then you have a foundation of basic skills. And on that foundation of basic skills, we can begin to introduce and talk about the creative elements, such as interpretation or improvisation or original composition. But no one would imagine that you could just throw an instrument at someone and say, here, fool around, and expect the same quality of musicianship that you would get as you will through what has been the time-honored approach of imitating your teacher. And once your teacher, once you surpass your teacher, you go look for someone better to imitate. So that's really the theme. And then in terms of copy work, we would look at that as the very, very beginning of the process of imitation, where you're not trying to think of what to say. You're not trying to figure out a sentence. As Suzanne said, it's so true. Doing all of that at once, especially for younger children in the elementary grades, it can be overwhelmingly complex. They get overwhelmed with the complexity and kind of shut down, say, I don't know what to do. I can't think of anything. So with copy work, we're saying, well, you don't have to do any of that. You can copy these letters, copy these words, copy this sentence, include the punctuation, learn some mechanics by just internalizing it through doing it. And that sets a foundation for stamina. It sets a foundation for attentiveness, and it's patterning correct language and maybe even artistic language use, depending on what you're copying, from the very first step. So to me, when I see elementary schools, particularly in the primary grades, K1, 2, and they just throw out copy work, baby with the bathwater, saying, well, that's non-creative, uninteresting, too tedious, rote, there's no value. There's a tremendous, tremendous ignorance that causes that, and a great lack of foundation for kids in the basic skills of putting words on paper and expressing ideas.
Andrew, that makes such perfect sense. The analogy seems so apt. Why is it that we don't, in the teaching of composition or writing, we don't naturally see the analog with the training in music, or for that matter, the training in any other art that is to be acquired? How was it that we sort of lost that insight concerning writing?
Well, my theory is that it's very misdirected Deweyism. So John Dewey wrote, Experience in Education. He wanted schools and learning and education to all be about exploration and discovery and spontaneity and creativity and self-expression. And he pushed these ideas pretty strongly. And, a lot of what he said is of value, but he also had some ideas that really were misdirected and applied that eliminated some of these foundational basic skills. So copy work, well, is it expressive? Is it experiential? Is it discovery? Not really, honestly. It's more like playing, scales and etudes. You just do it. But why do you do it? You don't play scales and etudes so that you can perform scales and etudes. You play those things so that when you need the skill, you have it later on. Another thing that would be misguided Deweyism is his attitude about memorized language. He basically said memorization at best is a waste of time, and at worst, it will stifle spontaneous expression. And yet we know, we go back to the ancient tradition that the foundations of grammar and rhetoric were all building in the memory and learning what people had done and practicing that until maybe, if you're lucky, you could expand and then your work would become an example for the next generation to come. So I think I would pin it really on how Deweyism began to infect schools of education and teacher training programs. And then that kind of crystallized with the 60s and 70s when everything really became about, writing is about self-expression. And I get people walk up to me and say, especially homeschool convention, they'll say, I just want my son, daughter, whatever, to be able to express themselves on paper. And I challenge that right off. Writing is not about expressing yourself. It's about expressing ideas. And if you get good at that and you live long enough, you may have an original idea that's worth expressing. I'm not sure I ever had. I'm pretty sure everything I ever thought of came from somewhere else. But when we shift the context to, it's about learning to express ideas, those ideas can come from a myriad of places. They don't all have to originate in your feelings. And I think that was the attitude of a lot of teachers, and it kind of coalesced with, the free, democratic, let's lower all the structures, let's do away with the things that are limiting. And it kind of backfired because we can actually trace the decline of reading and writing in the United States back to the 60s and 70s. That's when it began to the basic skills began to fall, and we've never got back as a country to the basic skills we had even then, and especially not in the earlier part of the 20th century.
Well, Suzanne, you mentioned that your time in training, which obviously would have been after the 60s or 70s, clearly did not equip you efficiently or effectively, rather, for those classrooms. But then you discovered a classical school and there began to experience some of this imitation and the approach that incorporates imitation in writing. Yeah. How did that affect you personally? And then as you have led other teachers, how do they respond to this imitative approach?
It's been really powerful to be a part of it. I think something that had a profound effect on me was when I read the phrase, practice does not make perfect, practice makes permanent. And when you have a young child writing something incorrectly, spelling because, B-E-C-U-Z, or writing in stream of consciousness, not having periods and long run-on paragraphs and not beginning with a capital letter, they're practicing and building really bad habits over and over again. And so when I moved into working on copy work and could see the children writing a beautiful, even in, say, first grade, a beautiful sentence that had proper spacing, where the handwriting was lovely, where every word was spelled correctly and included, and they could experience success and they were building good habits. That was really exciting for me to see as a teacher, that I'd rather have that one sentence of beautiful copy work than a half a page of confused gobbledygook. And initially, I think a lot of the teachers at our school, as we moved more into copy work and imitative practices that had come from other backgrounds, were reticent. Will it stifle a child's creativity? Will it be boring for them? We said, you know what, trust it. Let's trust the process. This works for so many other subjects that we teach, to have a whole to parts approach and to imitate masters. And let's trust the process. And so people gave it a good year implementing it, doing well. And then at the end of the year, we're able to reflect and see how much their students had grown in their copy work accuracy, their speed, their enjoyment of copy work, the students' desire and ability to be thorough and precise in their writing and develop those good habits and skills, that it was really gratifying. Teachers started to believe in it and wanted to do it more and more, and we're excited about it.
It sounds as though the students themselves were enthusiastic. Is that true?
They were. They'd make a mistake, and you say, hey, you made a mistake, try to find it. And they would love trying to find their mistake and fix it. And then you could reward the thoroughness, the attention to the precision, the attention to detail, all those moral virtues that they're learning through copy work, that they were excited to see themselves produce beautiful scholarly things, even if it was copy work.
Right. Well, let me ask another question, because we speak of the language arts, and I want to be clear that while we're attending to composition and the instruction needed to help students write, we also recognize the interrelationship between the text, reading, speaking, listening, and then ultimately composing for themselves. But students are in this world of language. So, Andrew, tell me a little bit more about the relationship between reading and the development of writing for our students.
Yes, it's fascinating, and I kind of had hints about this, but it kind of all crystallized for me. I was having a conversation with a superintendent of a small school district in Washington, and he said to me that the language arts, as most teachers think of them, you'd start thinking about decoding, maybe phonics, word. I don't know what they call it, making inferences. I would call it like trying to guess words because you can't figure out what they are. You've got handwriting and maybe cursive, and then of course you've got reading comprehension, and you've got grammar, and you've got maybe public speaking, and the list is almost endless, which is why most people don't like the term language arts, because it conjures up a whole lot of kind of unpleasant and possibly overwhelming stuff at the same time. And so I said to him, I don't like the term, and he said to me, well, that's because you don't know what they are. So I took a little humble pill and said, okay, what are they? And he said, well, in a more classical way of thinking, there's 4 language arts: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And the latter 2, reading and writing, are predicated on, they are a function of the former 2, listening and speaking. And then he said, I think the smartest thing I've ever heard anyone in a public school ever say, he said, one of our biggest problems in education is we put so much effort into teaching reading and writing because we test those that we end up not cultivating, we give short shrift to listening and speaking because we don't assess them. And I just thought that is so perceptive and accurate. But let's unpack it a little bit and think about, okay, the relationship between listening and speaking is pretty obvious. It is extremely unlikely, if not impossible, for a young child to speak and use verbally a word they have not heard, probably many times. Now, as you get closer to adulthood, you can maybe read a word and then try to use it in conversation, but that's more of an adult function rather than the language development period that most children are in up through, say, puberty and early teens. So that's kind of obvious, but what about listening and reading? Well, if you're reading along and you see a word like a word you don't necessarily know by sight, you don't recognize, you try to sound it out. You go sa-l-igaha, saligaha, sligaha, sligaha. What's a sligaha? That can't be sligaha. There's no such word as sligaha. How do you know there's no such word as sligaha? You never heard it before. Why have you never heard it? Because nobody ever used it. So you say, okay, it's not a possibility that it's that. What might it be then? And you stare at it a little bit longer, and then hopefully you notice it's E-I-G-H. That's one of them A words, like eight and way. This word must be sleigh. And so you figure out the word, but it only works if you already know what a sleigh is, right? If you don't know what a sleigh is, you can maybe say the word, but you wouldn't know what it means. So your reading would be blocked at that point. Now, how would you ever learn what a sleigh is? Well, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure you guys in Phoenix don't have many sleighs around. You would have had to hear that word in a poem or a story or maybe a conversation, but more likely in a picture book where there was a mention of a sleigh and a picture or a description. And so that meaning of that word gets built into the language areas of the brain through the ear primarily. And then when you read it, you see it, you know what it is. Your your reading comprehension is almost entirely dependent upon the words you've heard before. So cultivating good listening skills, critical. How about writing? Well, when you're writing, and Suzanne alluded to this, she said you have to say a sentence to yourself, basically. You have to be able to construct a sentence. So when you're writing, you're basically talking to yourself. So you have to have an idea. It can exist in the imagination, or it can exist immediately in your world, maybe in a source text, or write about something that you're looking at right now. So you have an idea, then you have to speak that idea into existence. Then you have to hear what you heard yourself say to yourself. And that can be tough because some kids don't hear what they say. And then you have to remember, you have to hold that in your memory long enough to go get the technical information of how to write the letters and spell the word, and if it's a capital and all that stuff. And so, Suzanne said that is where kids can just get overwhelmed. And so what we have noticed is that when you embed kind of this practice of speaking and reinforcing the use of words verbally, it's hugely beneficial to when you ask kids to do that same thing, only silently and on paper.
Suzanne, as you developed your own understanding at the Classical Academy that you were working at, did you begin to see this interrelationship between those language arts and specifically reading as it would affect writing?
Yeah, absolutely. They're intertwined. I think I really profoundly saw it when I was working with students whose first language was not English, and would see them develop their speaking skills and their listening skills with it. And then the reading would come, and then the writing would often come last. But yeah, absolutely, totally interconnected. It would also be interesting to see how when the teacher would read aloud, how the students would imitate in the way they would read and speak, or when they would do poetry memorization, how that was, and they would be speaking those things, and then those words would become part of their internal storehouse, and they would use them in their speaking and writing.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about that, because memorization is one of the features of the classical schools, the classical school that you work at, of course, and the Great Arts Academies and many of the classical schools across the country, and homeschoolers who are also adopting this model. I'm wondering how memorization fits in, or how it enhances or otherwise essentially equips the young writer, and what you've seen, Suzanne, and obviously, Andrew, I'd like to know how this works in the IEW approach. Suzanne?
Sure. Poetry memorization is part of our curriculum, beginning in kindergarten with nursery rhymes up through 5th grade. In 4th grade, they learn all of Paul Revere's Ride, all 13 stanzas. It's absolutely incredible. The ability young children have to memorize large amounts of things, and how much they enjoy doing it and reciting it in front of others. And it took me a little while to realize it, but then to see how much the poetry memorization actually impacted their ability to write. And Andrew could probably give more detailed information on this, but from what I've observed, it's because they develop an understanding of beautiful ways to put words together, and they augment their vocabulary through being exposed to these beautiful things over and over again, and memorizing them really solidifies it in that internal warehouse that they can pull from.
Andrew, how does this work within IEW's model?
Well, one of the things, when we start, we begin with a source text, a little Aesop fable, some interesting information about a person, place, thing. And we teach the students how to read a sentence, choose a maximum of 3 keywords from that sentence, copy the keywords into an outline. So this is one step removed from copy work. So you're not copying a whole sentence, you're just copying 3 keywords. Then you read the next sentence, think, okay, what are the key words? What are the words that would carry the meaning here? Choose them and then copy them into the outline, and continue until you had copied, 2 or 3 keywords from each sentence of this short source text. That's really our Unit 1 activity, but we don't stop with just copying, because we always encourage the teachers and parents to have the students then verbally reconstruct the sentence from the keyword outline. So you put the original source text away, and then you look at your 3 words, say, well, why did I write that? Why did I choose that? And then you create a sentence by kind of adding in all the words that are needed. And children naturally, unless they are second language learners or have some kind of actual learning differences in the language areas, most children by the age of 6 or 7 speak in complete sentences quite naturally. So what we find then is that by giving them a chance to speak the content, they are reconstructing a grammatically correct sentence, which they can then hear themselves say. So we want to do this verbally out loud. And then we actually segue that into a public speaking program that continues through all 9 of the units, or can, depending on what the teachers have time for. I would like to mention, though, in this context of the power of memory, one of the, what I think, most remarkable human beings that has ever lived that I know of, and that's Frederick Douglass. I hope most of everyone listening has read one or more versions of his autobiography. But what strikes me about Douglass is he was completely deprived of any type of formal education for the first 12 years of his life. It was illegal to teach an enslaved person how to read or really anything. He was in a very harsh situation, working, all his waking hours. And so you would say that, short of being chained into a closet, it was probably the worst possible educational background anyone could have during the most significant period of his intellectual development in terms of speed of brain growth in the first 12 years of life. Then, skipping forward a bit, I think we would acknowledge he was one of the great, if not, I would argue, the greatest orator of his time. I don't know anyone from his time forward that could give speeches as eloquent, as convincing, as convicting, as deep as Douglass. You read his speeches and you just are in awe. So it kind of raises the question, how did this person who had zero formal education during most all of his childhood become this incredibly powerful orator with this amazing vocabulary and eloquence and literary and biblical allusions that were just unbelievable? And someone asked him, Mr. Douglass, how did you become such an incredible speaker or such a powerful orator? And he said, well, as a free man, one of the first books I owned was The Columbian Orator. This was published in 1795, 4 or 5, if I remember. And it is a collection of the great speeches of all of history, from Cicero to Augustine, all the way up to Luther, and then into the founding fathers, Patrick Henry. The greatest that have been said or translated into English in, a fairly small, typical volume of, the late 1700s. And this is what he said: I committed them all to memory and practiced. So he developed in great part his vocabulary, his syntax, but not just that, his connection with literary expression and the ability to use simile and metaphor and allusions, and even furnishing his mind with some of the seminal ideas of justice and what is humanity and truth and freedom. And to me, that is just an amazing testament to the power of how memorized language can come out in a time and a place for a powerful expression of one's own concerns, one's own ideas. So I refer everyone to consider that. And of course, I could tell you an hour worth of stories of how I've seen kids who've memorized poetry, the words or little phrases or clauses from poems may come out in their writing, but they can change the nouns, verbs, adjectives, whatever. So you memorize a template, and then you have a more sophisticated grammatical template than you would ever encounter in just daily conversation.
Sure. Yeah.
I would add, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Suzanne. I was going to ask you thoughts,
Oh,
questions, or
yeah.
examples of this. Yeah.
Thank you. I would add to that students absolutely delight in it. It's so fun for them. Even beginning in kindergarten, they get so excited about memorizing a speech and then being able to present that to somebody. It's really a fun experience for them. And then when they do incorporate it into their writing and they see that it's beautiful, they're so proud of themselves and excited about it. There it is one of the greatest joys of being a teacher is when you see a child delight in a poem, and especially when a young child says, "Oh, the way they put the words together, that was so beautiful. Did you see how they," and they start to figure out all the interesting things that were done in the poem, and that they are delighted by ways words are put together, that they could see it in a different way than maybe they do in literature or just regular speech.
It's so important because we hear often of the critique, perhaps going back to John Dewey himself, that a classical approach is in some sense less creative, as you said earlier, Andrew, or perhaps it's boring or otherwise lifeless or lacking in vitality. But what I hear both of you describing and what I've seen myself in classical schools is the joy and the excitement, the enthusiasm for the quality of expression, the good words, right? Well spoken. I do want to make mention then, and maybe you can elaborate for us, Andrew, on the relationship between the imitative approach that you described and the classical rhetoric, because you mentioned memory and Douglas's commitment to memory, committing to memory some of the greatest speeches that he could get his hands on at the time. Are there other dimensions of classical rhetoric that really are woven into the method that we're promoting here?
Sure, absolutely. And I like to sneak in this comment if I can. I find it very odd that teachers would, in the general public progressive world, kind of sneer at or frown on having kids memorize poetry in class. Parents may not have grown up with that, so they don't appreciate it. But then they all think it's super cute when the kids memorize pop songs or rap. So, my point here would be if you don't give children beautiful, good stuff to memorize, they'll memorize whatever garbage is in their environment. They're wired for memory.
Yeah.
That's a natural function. So why would we not want to make the most of that by giving them things that are good and true and beautiful? But to more directly answer your question about expanding imitation beyond just, the developing the memory, the way the ancient students of rhetoric did. And I think some of our listeners here may be familiar with the idea of the progymnesmata, the classical exercises for training in rhetoric. Well, in most progymnesmata systems, the very first one is retell a fable. So now you're going to be kind of using an existing story and retelling that story. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit. Maybe you can do it in a slightly different way than was done before. And, I have a lot of personal compassion for children, boys in particular, who don't like to write when they don't know what to say. Because I remember being in fourth and fifth grade, and the teacher, I had sweet teachers. They're so enthusiastic. Okay, children, today we get to write stories, and you can write anything you want to. And I'm just thinking, no, please God, no, not that. Because I would get stuck with this piece of paper, and I would crank out once upon a time there was and then I would be like dead in the water. And of course, inevitably, I'm right across the aisle from some girl who's 4 pages into her next novel by the time I've got Once Upon a Time There Was. And I remember thinking, like, how does she do that? Because for me, I guess I thought that in order to legally write a story, I had to somehow think of something that nobody else ever thought of before. But if you had said to me, hey, Andy, you can retell a story that you read, that your parents read to you. I could have done that. I could have retold fairy tales. I could I could have possibly retold the whole Lord of the Rings if you gave me enough time. And I would have been excited about doing that because that was grist for my mill. That was something to work with. But when it was like, you have to make it all up, whether that was explicit or implicit in the instructions, I don't know. But that was that idea like, oh no, I can't write something that someone else might have ever written. I couldn't do it. So, in our system, the next step after, keywords from every sentence is to retell a story. And we use fables and myths and fairy tales and legends and things that have been retold by hundreds of people for hundreds of years. So there's no crime. There's no plagiarism going on here. If retelling, the Hare and the Tortoise was plagiarism, well, there'd be a lot of people in jail. So that is a next step in imitation that I find, and as Suzanne has found, I'm sure, children really enjoy doing that. They enjoy retelling things they know because for them, knowing is a joy. And so they get to tell you what they know. They get to share the joy. My grandchildren just constantly regale me with all the things they have been learning, all the stories they've heard and read. Why? Well, because that's how we share our joy. So that would be the next step in kind of a longer sequence of using imitation along the lines of the progymnasmata, but in a way that teachers and parents and students can really understand much more easily.
Thank you for that. I did want to ask both of you, because obviously Andrew is the founder of IEW. You've put this together, this approach with a 9-step process. And we're going to include show notes with this podcast so that folks who want to go and take a look at what you have there on the website will be able to explore this further. But I'd like to just very briefly, if you would, Andrew, sketch out how these 9 units flow from the beginning of note making, as you just described it a few moments ago, to ultimately developing a formal composition.
Okay, yeah, very quickly. So Unit 3, as I said, is retelling narrative stories. And so it's a 3-paragraph model, so it's a very specific length. And although some children can write paragraphs that are much shorter or longer than other children, but it gives a story structure so they know what they're trying to accomplish with each paragraph. Unit 4, we introduce a paragraph model that's good for summarizing and expository writing. And we have some rules like the topic clincher rule and some guidelines on how to choose the facts or details that go in. So again, it's an approach of imitation. So here's a paragraph. Well, here's a model outline for what you do to get a paragraph. Then in Unit 5, we move a little bit more into the imaginative side where you don't get a story per se, but you get a set of pictures and a method of asking questions or thinking about those pictures so that you can write event descriptions. And that's usually a fun unit for the kids who like the wild and crazy. Let's imagine, let's break the laws of logic, which a lot of kids do well with. I didn't as a kid. I was always like, no, it has to make sense. But not all children are in that zone, and I appreciate that. Unit 6, we have a method of teaching a research process kind of in microcosm, like 1-paragraph research paper where you're using 2 or 3 or more sources of information, creating outlines from each, and then creating a fused outline, and then writing from that. So that's an imitation of a process that we're teaching. And then once you do that a few times, then you can do something longer, which is, of course, building up to where we want to go, especially in the higher grades and the more advanced students. Unit 7 is what we call inventive writing. Originally, we called it creative writing because that's where there's nothing except just you, your brain, and whatever you happen to carry around in it. So you're relying entirely on imagination and memory. And a lot of writing programs start there, and the kids are just not ready for that level. They don't have the momentum, the stamina, the methodology. Whereas when we get to Unit 7, usually in the spring, February, March, somewhere in there, they're used to writing paragraphs, multi-paragraph compositions. They're used to organizing. They're used to using outlines. So here, rather than saying, okay, just start writing sentences, stream of consciousness, journaling style. No. First, let's think about what you're going to write, divide it into topics, and then make a little outline for each paragraph in your plan there. And then you can still write from an outline, but the information came from your mind rather than an external source. That's Unit 7. Unit 8 is where these two tracks kind of come together. This is the formal essay. And in some of our materials, we only get there at say grade 6 and up. So in the elementary, we kind of stop around Unit 7 just so they can have more time to play with that. Although there's, some teachers do get to the Unit 8. This is minimum 5 paragraphs. And, for 9-10-year-old kids, that can take a bit of time of investment. But this is where you collect up, organize, and present facts, and you add in your opinion about those facts. Or the next step would be to have an opinion about something and then go collect up and organize information to support that opinion. And so an essay is really the combination of skills, the skill of collecting up, organizing, and presenting facts you get from somewhere, information external to you, and adding to it your own thoughts, reflections, ideas about that information. And so Unit 8 is kind of the integration, and then Unit 9 is a bit of an extension off that. It's a critique, which would kind of replace a book report. And you would read a short story or a selection that has a narrative element and kind of retell that, but then add in what is good or not good, what is liked or not liked, what is effective or ineffective. And then we even have extensions off these for high school students, response to literature, advanced essay, persuasive essay, things like that. So, but no one is ever stuck, I don't know what to write, I don't know what to do, because we have this runway of increasingly sophisticated but always available models for imitation. And that's really where we see such great success with both the struggling or less experienced writers and the high talent writers. Guess what? The really creative kids, they get even more creative when you give them more tools to work with.
Suzanne,
so beautiful. It's so beautiful.
Well,
I love it. Can I tell a quick story?
Please.
When our school first implemented IEW and we were rolling out the curriculum that we were going to be using, and typically when you have a room full of teachers and you announce we're adopting a new curriculum and here's your 20 hours of training you need to do and your workbook, and sometimes that can take a moment for people to process all that information and get excited about it. And when we shared the 9 modules and how the steps were going to be given to help students, to equip them step by step, and that the teacher had good guidance of how to deliver it step by step, the teachers actually cheered. They stood up and started cheering with excitement that they had the strategies and tools and proper curriculum to do it really well with their students. It was exciting. I've never had that experience when rolling out new curriculum.
I think that's probably pretty rare, Suzanne. So let's give 3 cheers for IEW. Suzanne, because you have used it and had such success, maybe you just offer one piece of advice or encouragement for teachers in our audience as to how they might go about beginning this process themselves.
Oh gosh, there's so many things that come to mind. I think it would be trust the process for a year. Follow the guide and implement it with fidelity. And then honestly reflect on the results that you accomplished in that year based on what you were able to achieve in the past. And then you'll see the proof. And if you're an administrator or teacher, your teachers will see the proof too.
Yeah. Andrew, any last words of encouragement for us in regard to your work?
Well, I love what Suzanne said, trust the system. I have said that to children and parents and teachers, just give it a year. One really good thing I think that can help people get this concretely, and I do this almost every time when I teach classes. I did it with the video classes I recorded over the last few years. First day of the year, or first week of the year, give kids some paper and say, you got 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever's appropriate for their age. Write about your home. Ready, set, go. Sit down, ignore them for 15 minutes. Collect all the papers. Don't even read them. Just throw them in a folder or an envelope. And then say, okay, now we're not going to do that again for a long, long time. Get going with Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3. Work through the 9 units. At the end of the school year, last week or next to last week, give them some paper. Give them the exact same assignment. You have 15 minutes to write about your home. Ready, set, go. Sit down and ignore them. Beep, time's up. Then go pull out the beginning of the year. Hand it all out to them. And let the students themselves see side by side, and then, maybe say, does anybody notice a difference? And I have never had this happen where the students were like, wow, I wrote 3 times as much, or wow, my vocabulary is so much better, or well, I kind of wrote the same things, but this one's so much more interesting. It was like the kids themselves know that they've improved. And you know as well as I do that that's the key to motivation. You can't cheerlead someone into liking something, but what you can do is lead them to a process where they improve. And then guess what? They start to like that thing. So, I always say to parents and teachers, I really don't care if your students like writing. That's the wrong objective. But if they get better, you may discover the side benefit is they like it, or at least hate it less.
Well, in the spirit of this podcast, we are looking for that very virtue, that excellence within the written word that comes from the very experiences that you have both described. And I want to thank you both for joining us, because this has been a lovely conversation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
For allowing us to come. It was wonderful.
Thank
you, Suzanne. I wish I could come and visit your school someday.
You have an open invitation. Anytime you ever want to come, I'd love to see you. We'd love to see you.
Great.
Thanks to both of you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.